Every country on earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. And the entire planet, every government, every corporation, every household combined owes $315 trillion. That's 3 times larger than the entire global economy. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? It's a question that shatters the illusion, because when you trace the chain of creditors, when you follow the money through governments, institutions, and central banks, you discover something deeply unsettling. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. And yet, every dollar of that debt generates interest that flows upward, always upward, to the few who designed the machine that made it all possible. This isn't a conspiracy. It's documented history. The meetings happened. The contracts exist. The architecture is public record. Over the last 3 centuries, 4 men, 4 bankers each solved a problem that governments faced: how to spend more than they earned without losing power. And in solving that problem, they created something far greater: a self-sustaining system of debt that could never be repaid, a machine that feeds on taxes, interest, and belief endlessly. Each man added one piece to the puzzle. William Paterson, 1694, made debt permanent. Nathan Rothschild, 1815, made debt global. J.P. Morgan, 1913, made debt infinite. Paul Volcker, 1982, made debt inescapable. Together, they didn't just finance wars or rescue economies. They built a structure that now governs the modern world, a financial architecture so vast and intricate that no government can leave it without collapsing its own economy. Every crisis, every bailout, every stimulus you've ever heard of, all are gears turning inside the same engine. $38 trillion in U.S. Debt isn't a problem waiting to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. To understand how this machine was built and why it can never stop, we have to go back to the beginning. To the year 1694, when a Scottish merchant named William Paterson convinced a desperate king to sell the future for a war he couldn't afford. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the old way. They went to merchants or nobles, promised repayment with interest, and prayed the next battle wouldn't bankrupt the crown. If they couldn't pay, they defaulted. Creditors lost money, and the king's reputation suffered, but the system reset. Debt was temporary, a burden that cleared with time. Then came William Paterson, a restless Scottish merchant, failed entrepreneur, and visionary opportunist. In 1691, England was bleeding money. King William III was at war with France. The treasury was empty, taxes exhausted, and creditors refused to lend. England had defaulted before. No one trusted the crown. Paterson saw what others missed. A crisis was the perfect time to rewrite the rules. He proposed a plan so bold it would reshape civilization. He offered to raise $1.2 million, roughly $300 million today, from wealthy merchants. In exchange, they would receive something extraordinary: the loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay 8% interest every year forever. The mechanism was elegant. Paterson and his investors would deposit their gold into a new institution, the Bank of England. The bank would lend that gold to the government. The government would pay annual interest from tax revenue. The bank would pass those payments back to the investors. The key detail: the principal would never be returned. The loan became permanent. For the merchants, this was genius, a guaranteed stream of income backed by Parliament's legal authority to tax the population. As long as England existed, the payments would flow. For the king, it was salvation. For the people, it was the birth of eternal obligation. But Paterson's real breakthrough was not the perpetual loan. It was what the Bank of England could do next. The bank was authorized to issue paper notes backed by that government debt. That meant the government's IOU itself became money. England had just created money from debt. The more the government borrowed, the more currency the bank could issue. For the first time in history, national debt became a feature, not a failure. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France, the Netherlands, Austria all established central banks tied to state debt. And by 1790, even the young United States adopted the same pattern under Alexander Hamilton. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly rich, but the system he built, a government borrowing from private financiers, paying interest forever, still stands. 3 centuries later, British government debt has never been paid off. It has only been refinanced, expanded, and normalized. What began as a wartime necessity became the cornerstone of the modern financial world. Debt had become permanent, and power had found its first infinite source of income. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was drowning in wars. The Napoleonic conflicts had turned the continent into a furnace that devoured men, gold, and governments. Every nation was borrowing, every treasury was strained, and every king was desperate. It was the perfect moment for one family to seize the flow of history itself. That family was the Rothschilds. They began as money changers in Frankfurt, but by 1800, Meyer Amschel Rothschild had planted 5 sons across Europe and London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, forming the first true international banking network. They moved gold, information, and credit faster than any army could move soldiers. At the center of this web was Nathan Rothschild, stationed in London. He realized that Paterson's idea, debt as permanent, could be elevated to a new level, make it global. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan supplied the British government with loans, bullion, and bonds. But his true innovation wasn't in lending, it was in distribution. Instead of giving the government money directly, he bought government bonds at a discount, then resold them to investors at a markup. He created the secondary market for sovereign debt. It was a revolution. Now anyone with capital, nobles, merchants, even foreign investors, could buy a piece of a nation's debt and collect interest. Government debt became tradable, liquid, and profitable. The system exploded. By 1815, when Napoleon marched toward his final defeat at Waterloo, Nathan's courier network was the fastest in Europe. When the French army fell, Rothschild knew before anyone in London. He used the information with surgical precision. First, he sold British bonds, causing panic. The market believed Britain had lost. Prices collapsed. Then, before the truth reached the public, he quietly bought everything back. When victory was announced, the next day, bond prices surged, and Nathan Rothschild made millions in hours. But the true genius wasn't profit, it was control. Rothschild realized that by connecting every bondholder across borders, he had made sovereign debt too interconnected to fail. A default in one country could ripple through the entire financial system. From that day, governments could no longer walk away from their debts. Doing so would trigger chaos not just at home, but abroad. Debt was no longer a bilateral contract. It had become a web, invisible, unbreakable, and global. By 1820, if a nation wanted to borrow, it had to go through the Rothschild network. They set the terms, the rates, the timing. Kings and ministers came not to negotiate, but to ask permission. Paterson had made debt permanent. Rothschild made it universal. And from that moment, no government on earth could default without bringing the whole world down with it. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States had become an industrial titan. Railroads stretched from ocean to ocean, steel fed the world's cities, and oil built empires. But beneath the surface, America's financial system was fragile, chaotic, and deeply unstable. Thousands of private banks issued their own currency, each backed by its own reserves. Money was local, inconsistent, and vulnerable to panic. And panic struck in 1907, markets collapsed. Banks failed overnight. Ordinary citizens lined up in the streets demanding gold for paper that no longer held trust. The stock market fell 50%. The entire economy teetered on the edge of ruin. Then one man stepped in, John Pierpont Morgan. At 70 years old, the Titan of Wall Street gathered the country's most powerful bankers in his private library on Madison Avenue. He locked the doors and refused to let them leave until they pledged their fortunes to stabilize the system. Morgan's money and his will stopped the collapse. He became the de facto central bank of the United States, a single man saving a nation with private capital. But Morgan knew this could never happen again. He was mortal. His empire wasn't. So he and his associates began planning a permanent solution, a system that could print stability itself. In 1910, 6 men boarded a private train to a secluded island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. Among them were Senator Nelson Aldrich, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and representatives from the biggest banks in America, Morgan Rothschild and Warburg interests. They told reporters they were going on a duck hunting trip. They weren't. For 9 days behind locked doors, they wrote the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. The brilliance of their design was deception. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called a Federal Reserve. It wouldn't be owned by the government. It would be owned by private member banks, the same banks that caused the panic in the first place. Each regional reserve bank would be a private corporation required by law to pay its shareholders, commercial banks like J.P. Morgan and Co., Citibank, and Goldman Sachs, a 6% guaranteed dividend every year. The illusion was perfect, a federal system that was neither federal nor a reserve. When the Federal Reserve Act passed quietly on December 23, 1913, most members of Congress had already left for Christmas. Within days, the United States government lost the power to create money directly. From that moment on, every dollar in existence would enter circulation as debt borrowed from the Federal Reserve at interest. The bankers no longer needed gold. They had something better, a machine that could create infinite money from infinite debt. Paterson had made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it limitless, and the world would never be the same again. By the late 1970s, the machine built by Paterson, Rothschild, and Morgan had gone global, but it was starting to shake. The Vietnam War, the oil crisis, and runaway government spending had eroded the dollar's value. Inflation soared above 10%. The world was losing faith in the American currency that anchored the system. Then came Paul Volcker, a tall, stoic economist, appointed as chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Volcker inherited a nightmare double-digit inflation, collapsing confidence, and a country that had just severed its link to gold. If the dollar died, the global debt system would go with it. His solution was brutal. He raised interest rates higher than any time in U.S. history, from 11% to nearly 20%. Overnight mortgages doubled, factories closed, and millions lost their jobs. But inflation fell. The dollar was saved at a terrible cost. Yet hidden beneath that sacrifice was a second effect, one far more permanent. For 2 decades, developing nations had been borrowing heavily in dollars to fund infrastructure, dams, and industries. When Volcker's interest rate shock hit those nations, debts tripled overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion, and none could pay. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make its payments. It should have been the end of the system, the first great sovereign default of the modern era. If Mexico fell, American banks like Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America would lose billions. The entire Western banking system would crack. Volcker had a choice: Let the banks fail or save them. He chose the latter, and in doing so turned debt into a weapon of control. Through the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the United States and its allies issued rescue loans, not to forgive debt, but to keep interest payments flowing. The IMF's money went straight back to American and European banks. In return, borrowing nations were forced to obey strict structural adjustment conditions, cut public spending, privatize state industries, devalue currencies, and open markets to foreign corporations. The result, economies shrank. Unemployment soared, but the payments never stopped. Debt had evolved from a financial obligation into a geopolitical leash. From Mexico to Brazil, from Africa to Asia, nations learned a cruel truth: you can't default on the global banking system because the system itself will rewrite your debts to keep you paying. Volcker died in 2019 praised as the man who saved the dollar. Few remembered that he also made the global debt trap permanent. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite, and Volcker made it inescapable. 3 centuries after Paterson's experiment, the system has matured into something vast, invisible, mathematical, and unstoppable. From London to New York, Tokyo to Frankfurt, the same mechanism hums beneath every government, every bank, every paycheck. Debt is no longer a condition. It is the operating system of the modern world. Here's how the cycle works now. The United States government spends more than it earns every single year. When Congress approves a new budget, it doesn't reach into a vault. It reaches into the future. The Treasury issues bonds, promises to repay with interest, and the Federal Reserve buys those bonds using money created with a keystroke. No gold, no savings, no limit. Those new dollars flow into the economy, paying salaries, funding projects, fueling consumption. People work, earn, and pay taxes, but those taxes don't just fund schools or roads. They flow back to the Treasury, which sends billions in interest payments to the very bondholders who funded the debt in the first place. The circle is complete. The government borrows. The central bank creates money. Citizens earn and pay taxes. Taxes service the debt, and the debt keeps expanding. In 2025, U.S. debt exceeds $38 trillion. Global debt surpasses $315 trillion, triple the size of the entire world economy. If that sounds unsustainable, it's because it is by design. Because in this system, debt is money. If the U.S. paid off its debt, those dollars would vanish from circulation. The economy would collapse overnight. That's why no modern government can ever be debt-free. The system demands constant borrowing to create new money to pay the old interest. It's an endless treadmill, one that speeds up every decade. And at the top of this pyramid sit the institutions that quietly own it all: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. Together, they control more than $30 trillion in assets, enough to buy every public company in America. They are the new Rothschilds, not kings of nations, but custodians of the entire global balance sheet. They buy government bonds with pension funds, retirement accounts, and insurance premiums, other people's money. Those bonds pay interest about $1 trillion per year in the U.S. alone. That money flows upward from workers to institutions, from taxes to portfolios, from labor to capital. It is the largest, most elegant wealth transfer in history, continuous, automatic, and invisible. Paterson gave debt permanence. Rothschild gave it reach. Morgan gave it scale. Volcker gave it teeth. And now in the 21st century, their system feeds on every transaction, every dollar, every dream. The debt isn't the problem. It is the product. 3 centuries, 4 architects, 1 system. From Paterson's promise to a desperate king, to Rothschild's bond empire, to Morgan's money machine, to Volcker's global leash. Every generation refined the same principal power is not held by those who govern but by those who lend. In 1694, debt became permanent. In 1815, it became global. In 1913, it became infinite. And in 1982, it became inescapable. Today, in 2025, it has become civilization itself. Every paycheck, every mortgage, every tax payment, every stimulus check, they are all transactions within the same invisible circuit. Governments borrow banks, create citizens' labor, and the interest flows upward like gravity. It is the unseen bloodstream of the modern age. And yet, it was never about numbers. It was about belief, the belief that debt equals wealth, that promises equal prosperity, that printed paper equals power. For 300 years, that illusion held civilization together. It built empires, powered wars, and bound nations into a single financial organism. But here's the truth hidden behind the architecture. If all the debts were repaid, there would be no money left. The system requires motion, constant, relentless borrowing because stillness is death. If borrowing stops the money supply contracts, factories close, banks collapse, governments fall, debt is no longer the shadow of the economy. It is the economy. And so we run faster, harder, endlessly to keep the treadmill turning, because the moment we stop, the illusion shatters. But understanding is the first act of freedom. To see the machine is to step outside it, to realize that wealth is not money, but time, not interest, but creation. That true value is built, not borrowed. Paterson gave the world its first loan that never ends. Rothschild made nations fear default. Morgan built the engine that prints the illusion of prosperity, and Volcker ensured no one could escape it. Now the question is no longer, who do we owe? It's how long will we keep believing? Because the moment belief fades, the empire of debt begins to tremble. And when that day comes, humanity will face its oldest truth, that freedom begins not with rebellion, but with understanding.